this bill their serious consideration, and I commend the bill to the House.
I call the Honourable Member Chris Farfoe. Talohani.
Talohani, Mr Speaker. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Corrections Amendment Bill first reading. It is a bill that we on this side of the House will be opposing on the principle that we disagree that private prisons should operate here in New Zealand around our thoughts that it is the role of the state to incarcerate and to rehabilitate. We do, though, believe that this bill will make its way to the Select Committee, and we welcome the opportunity to look at some of the measures that are contained in this bill, which we think aren't as negative as the private prisons in New Zealand. Mr Speaker, and that is what I do want to spend most of my time in, and that's around the question of who imprisons, whether it should be the state or whether it should be a private firm. I think Charles Chauvel, the previous speaker on the Labour side of the House, has made many points as to why we're opposed. The first one that I'd like to bring in is that I don't think in a society like New Zealand we should be having companies that operate prisons making profits out of incarcerating people who are charged by the state, who are tried by the state, who are sentenced by the state, and then at the final point in the justice system where they are sent to jail, all of a sudden they can find themselves in a prison which is not operated by the state. And this legislation will actually give private firms who run some of our prisons more power to determine what kind of security level they are at. And as Charles Chauvel said, we believe that function that is with the Chief Executive of the Department of Correction should not be delegated to anyone other than has the very close link to the Department of Corrections via the Chief Executive. We don't think that someone who is a paid professional who has the motivation of making a profit should be able to deem who is minimum security or who is a maximum security prisoner. Mr Chair, I've actually visited a couple of private prisons in Australia when this issue was being looked at I think it was the early 2000s, and we visited that as part of my role as a journalist, and when we spoke to some prisoners who had spent some time in both a state-run prison and a private prison, they had noticed marked differences in terms of the rehabilitation programs that were run between state and privately run prisons. And I believe it is our duty to make sure, in terms of our duty to the community, to make sure that we are having decent rehabilitation programs within our prisons to ensure that these prisoners aren't reoffending when they are eventually released. Mr Speaker, there are also a number of other measures in this bill which we will take a close look at, and one of those is around the provision of health services to inmates. And we note that an Ombudsman report released earlier this month noted that the provision of health services the onus of that should be moved away from the Department of Corrections and to a health agency. That is from our Ombudsman, but within this bill exactly the opposite is happening, and it is putting the responsibility for the provision of healthcare fairly and squarely of the Department of Corrections. And I think, as Charles Chauvel said, during the Select Committee process, which we anticipate, we'll be having a very close look at as to why the government is heading in a completely opposite direction around the provision of healthcare services at the Select Committee process. Mr Speaker, the previous member of the government who spoke on this bill did mention around the extension of the powers around 24-hour restraints. We will also look forward to debating that fully at the Select Committee stage. She did mention a couple of measures within the bill which she said negated our criticism of this move, but we still think we need to have a good look at the reasons as to why they no longer will need a justice to come and take a look at the situation if they want to, if the Department of Corrections wants to extend the use of mechanical restraints beyond 24 hours. We think that was a reasonably common sense safeguard prior to this bill coming into the House, so we'll be looking forward to being able to debate that at the Select Committee process, of course chaired by the previous member who spoke as well. Mr Speaker, there's also increased powers under this bill in respect of the use of strip searches, searches of prison cells, the opening of mail and submitting to drug and alcohol tests, and Labor want to be assured that the safeguards exist in respect of these powers, and especially in privately run prisons. We believe that if we are extending some provisions, delegations from the Chief Executive in one area, we want to make sure there are safeguards in this area where we are extending the power of officers in our prisons, that there are sufficient safeguards when they are being given more powers in respect of strip searches, searches of prison cells, opening mail and submitting to drug tests. Back to the first argument I made and the question of who imprisons in New Zealand. I'm not sure of any polling that is done, but I would think that most people would think that if citizens are charged, prosecuted and sentenced by the state, that it is the state that has the responsibility to carry out the incarceration and the rehabilitation of those prisoners. We don't feel that it is the role of private business to come into the sector to look to make profit out of those who have committed crimes in our community. And we also think that because of the profit-making motivation of these private companies, that it can actually end up in perverse outcomes. And Charles Chauvel talked about the California experience previously, where there were cases of judges sending people to prison on the understanding that they'd get money because of the high incarceration rates. And we don't think that we here in New Zealand should open ourselves up to that kind of thing. I'm not casting dispersions on the judiciary, but it does open up it just does open up the potential for perverse outcomes when you're looking at making profits out of our prison system. Mr. Speaker, there are also a number of things in this bill which we think do merit some further investigation at Select Committee. But we also think that in this case that maybe it's another case of legislation from this government, and I know that Jackie Dean was releasing some figures around 53% of people perceive that corrections is operating much better under a national government. But we do believe that this may be another case of where it's actually not practical in terms of what this bill is trying to achieve. The National Party is using this more as a plaything in terms of law and order to make sure it's looking tough on law and order issues and looking tough but not actually taking real action. And we believe in, if you're going to try to look tough on law and order, then trying to do that by opening up more and more operational activities to private companies in the prison sector is not the way to go about it. So we will oppose this bill on the principle that we do not believe that it is the right thing here in New Zealand, in our society, for private prisons to operate. A, because we don't believe it is the role of private companies to incarcerate. We believe it is the role of the state. And B, because we don't believe that it is right and proper that companies make profit off the incarceration of New Zealanders. It is, Mr. Speaker, our responsibility as a state to rehabilitate inmates. And as I mentioned earlier, in my experience in the Australian prisons, the rehabilitation aspect of the prisons, the private prisons that operate over there, were probably not as beneficial to the inmates as it was in the state prison system. So, Mr. Speaker, we will oppose this on the principle of our opposition to private prisons, but we will look forward to some further investigation of some of the other measures contained in the bill at the Select Committee stage.
I call the Honourable Member David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koe.